The slap didn't sound like a movie. It sounded like skin meeting ring, and the whole room deciding it had better stay quiet. 1 second, the VIP bubble was full of bass and soft laughter, and the next second, my cheek lit up, and every face turned toward me. I didn't fall. My knees locked, my tray stayed level, and my body did what it learned long ago. Freeze first, feel later. I swallowed, tasting metal, and stared at the dark carpet so nobody could watch me break. The Cobalt Lounge sat above River North Chicago, like a paid-for secret. The air smelled of champagne, citrus, and cologne. In here, the city's rules felt distant. My name is Harper Lane. I'm 28, a single mom, and I wait tables in a place where one good night can cover rent. I work late because the tips are bigger and because my son, Eli, is 7 and needs lunches, boots, and a mom who keeps the lights on. I tell myself I can handle anything for him, even this room that hums with money and threat. Dominic DeSantis owned the center booth without raising his voice. People moved around him the way they move around a loaded gun, carefully. When his eyes landed on you, it didn't feel like attention. It felt like a decision. Madison Clark sat beside him. Glossy hair, diamonds, a smile that stayed polite and empty. The other VIPs watched Dominic like weather, waiting to see where the damage would land. Nobody looked at me until I became damaged. I'd been at their table for maybe 10 seconds. I leaned in to refill a glass, careful and invisible the way servers are trained to be. My sleeve grazed a leather folder, and Dominic's attention snapped to my hands. His fingers closed around my wrist. Not quite painful, but claiming space. My chest tightened. I could already hear my manager's warning in my head. Keep your eyes down. Keep your mouth shut. Then Dominic's gaze dropped to his bare wrist. The watch was missing. I didn't know brands. I just knew weight and shine. Earlier, I'd seen it resting on the folder. Silver, understated, the kind of thing that costs more than my car. Dominic scanned the table, the seat, the floor. Calm on the surface. Something sharp underneath. The air changed like a door locking. My mind fired off useless truths. I hadn't touched his watch. I hadn't even looked at it twice. I had been thinking about Eli's spelling test and whether the grocery store still had the cheap cereal he likes. I had been counting minutes until I could check my phone, because my neighbor texts me if Eli wakes up scared. I tried to form an explanation, but my throat closed. Dominic's hand lifted and came down across my face. Heat, sting, then that hollow ringing that makes sound feel far away. For half a beat, the music kept going, and then it died, like someone pulled the plug. Laughter cut off mid-breath. Crystal froze in midair. Even the ice seemed to pause before settling back into the glasses. I stood there with my cheek burning and my eyes dry. I hated the part of me that wanted to cry. I hated the part that knew crying would make it worse. My body had practiced humiliation like it was a language, and it answered without my permission, going still and small. The VIP crowd became a courtroom. Men stared with detached focus. Women stared. Madison's eyes flicked over me like I was a stain on the tablecloth. My manager hovered near the bar, face pale, pretending to rearrange bottles. Nobody moved toward me. Nobody stepped between a man like Dominic and the waitress he decided to blame. Curiosity rose first. How fast could a room turn on a stranger? Then empathy hit, sharp, because I felt my own exhaustion double shifts. Sore feet, rent math like a bruise under my skin. Then anger arrived, steady, because I understood this wasn't really about a watch. It was about reminding everyone who could be accused without consequences. It was about taking the invisible girl and making her visible in the worst way. My phone vibrated once in my apron pocket, a buzz that made my stomach drop. Eli, school, home, anything could be happening. And I was standing here unable to reach for my child because a room full of strangers needed to see me punished. I pictured Eli's lunchbox on my counter. I pictured his hand in mine, the way he asked if I'd be home for pancakes on Saturday. I promised, yes. I build my life out of yeses. And under all of it, something older stirred, a past I ran from and never explained out loud. I recognized Dominic's type, not because I wanted to, but because I survived a man like him before. Men who don't hit because they lose control. Men who hit because they have it. I lifted my eyes from the carpet and realized, with clarity, that if I stayed small, nobody would save me. If I stayed small, I might not make it home to my son tonight. The room wasn't just watching anymore. It was waiting to bury me alive. The silence after the slap was worse than the slap. Sound didn't vanish. It thinned, like the VIP room had been shrink-wrapped. I heard my own breath, My cheek burned under Dominic DeSantis's ring, and when I swallowed, I tasted copper. I kept holding my tray because dropping it would have given everyone permission to look away. Nobody looked away. The Cobalt Lounge's VIP floor became a jury bankers, influencers with phones held low, and staff lined up in fear. No one stepped between a boss and a waitress. Not here. My phone vibrated in my apron pocket, and my stomach flipped. Eli's sitter only texted late if something was wrong. I pictured my son at our kitchen table this morning, swinging his legs and asking if I'd be home before he fell asleep. I had promised yes. Dominic didn't shout. He didn't need to. He moved closer with that calm that makes people obey without being asked. His watch was missing, and I had been close to his table. That was all the proof he needed. Glenn Parker finally appeared at the edge of the VIP section, my manager with slick hair and shaking hands. He didn't check my face. He didn't ask if I needed ice. He angled himself toward Dominic, eyes skimming over me like I was a problem to solve fast. I watched him decide to protect the lounge by sacrificing me. The humiliation turned procedural. Dominic's gaze dropped to my apron pockets, then to my bag under the host stand, then to the hallway where staff lockers sat like cheap metal coffins. His men shifted around him in black suits, hands hovering near their belts, already ready to escort me someplace private. I emptied my pockets because my body knew this script. Tips, a pen, a cracked lip balm, a folded receipt. I laid the pieces of my life out like evidence and waited for someone to say this was insane. No one did. Glenn murmured apologies toward Dominic. Apologies meant for him, not me. He offered access to my locker, my bag, anything. He made it clear, without saying it outright, that I was the easiest scapegoat in the room. Someone mentioned, casually, that the VIP cameras were disabled for privacy. I'd heard that rule before. It was why rich men paid to be here. Hearing it used like an excuse made my throat tighten. No footage meant no truth. No truth meant Dominic got to pick the story. And the story was that I stole from him. Shock slid into shame, then into anger. My face was hot, my eyes stung, and I refused to cry. I had survived by being invisible head down, voice soft, never arguing with powerful men. That strategy kept me employed long enough to raise my kid. It was failing in real time. Dominic's stare sharpened, and the threat behind it grew teeth. The idea of a backroom check hovered in the air, the kind of search that isn't really about property. The staff corridor suddenly felt like a trapdoor. I had learned, the hard way, that violence often starts with permission. My cheek pulsed with my heartbeat. I did the only thing I could without moving. I calculated. Rent is due in 2 weeks. Eli's inhaler refill. If I got fired, I would lose shifts. If I lost shifts, I lost childcare. If I lost childcare, the fragile stability I built for my son would crack. And if Dominic decided to make this criminal, not just cruel, I could be arrested on nothing but his word. I tried to speak anyway, but the words died inside my chest. My hands stayed open at my sides like surrender. I hated how familiar that felt. Then I noticed something that made my fear turn colder. Dominic's rage looked real, but it also looked aimed. He kept flicking his gaze past me toward a corner booth where 3 men sat too still, not drinking, not laughing. One wore a suit too perfect, his face unreadable, watching Dominic like he was grading a performance. Dominic's jaw tightened every time he checked that booth, like he needed this scene to land. So it wasn't only about a watch. It was about control. It was about showing the room and whoever was watching that he could accuse a working woman, humiliate her, and nobody would stop him. Glenn shifted behind me, whispering offers, and I realized he was volunteering more than my locker. He was violating my privacy, my dignity, my safety. He was saying the quiet rule out loud. Invisible girls are disposable. A flash of my past hit me another hallway, another locked door, another man whose calm was a warning. I had changed my name to Harper. I had built a small life where Eli's laughter was louder than my memories. I couldn't let this room become another cage. My phone buzzed again. I didn't dare touch it. Any sudden reach into my apron would be called suspicious. Any request to step aside would be called guilt. That's when my mind slid to the other phone. The burner I kept hidden for the worst nights. The one with a single emergency number saved inside it. The number I swore I would never dial again, because dialing it meant admitting my past could still reach me. I didn't pull it out. Not yet. I only felt its weight against my body and understood, with a clarity that steadied my hands, that nobody here was coming to save me. If I wanted to walk out of the Cobalt Lounge and make it home to my son, I might have to break my vow and make the call I promised I'd never make. Dominic's calm had turned predatory. He didn't raise his voice, but his men tightened the circle, and Glenn Parker hovered behind me like he was negotiating when he was really offering me up. The VIP hallway suddenly felt less like an exit, and more like where they meant to drag me. My cheek burned where his ring had caught me. Blood tasted metallic on my tongue. My phone vibrated again in my apron pocket, and my stomach dropped. Eli's sitter only reached out late if something was wrong. Eli was 7. He still believed promises. That's when pride died. I could not afford to be proud. Not tonight. I needed to get home alive, employed, and unarrested. My kid needed me more than I needed to keep my vow intact, so I reached for the thing I hated most. The burner phone lived against my body like a secret bruise. I'd carried it for years, taped under my apron line, because part of me never stopped listening for footsteps behind me. I told myself it was only for emergencies. I told myself I'd never use it. My fingers slid under the edge of my apron and found the cheap plastic rectangle. Peeling it free stung, like pulling off a bandage you don't want to look under. The phone looked ridiculous in the Cobalt Lounge, surrounded by crystal and designer everything. It wasn't sleek. It was the kind of device you keep when you're trying not to exist. The room reacted anyway. Heads tilted. A couple of people lifted their own phones to record. Glenn's eyes widened, already imagining police and bad press. Dominic watched the burner the way he'd watched my pockets, like it was evidence. Everyone assumed I was calling 911. In any normal place, I would have. But I'd learned that in Dominic DeSantis's world, the police can be a costume. Here, calling the cops would only prove I didn't understand where I was standing. I pressed and held the single saved number. I'd memorized it the way you memorize fire exits. I hadn't dialed it since I ran, changed my name, and promised myself my son would never meet that world. The ring sounded too loud in the hush. My hand shook once, then steadied. I pictured Eli's backpack by our door and kept breathing. The line connected fast, like the other end had been waiting. A man answered with a voice that was controlled and rough, the kind of calm that doesn't soothe, it warns. He spoke like someone who expects obedience. Hearing it again tightened my throat so hard I almost couldn't get air. I forced the word out anyway. I said "Dad" into the receiver, and it felt like swallowing glass and medicine at the same time. Something in me changed the moment I said it. Not triumph. Stillness. The part of me that survived snapped into place. I stopped looking at the crowd for help. I stared at Dominic because I suddenly understood the new rules. On the other end, the hard calm cracked into something urgent. My father said my name like he'd been starving. He demanded to know where I was, what had happened, and why I was calling after years of silence. The questions came fast, threaded with something I didn't want to fully trust. I kept my voice low. I gave him River North, Chicago, and the name of the lounge. I told him I needed help. Then I told him Dominic DeSantis had hit me. The shift on the line was immediate. The tenderness vanished. My father asked who, and when I said Dominic's name, he repeated it with a flat calm that felt like a lock clicking shut. I heard movement behind my father's voice. Footsteps, a door, another voice answering him like an employee. Not panic. Logistics. The sound of power turning into action. He told me he was already in motion. A private jet, a driver, men. He said he would be on the Chicago ground in less than an hour. He didn't promise comfort. He promised consequences, and my stomach twisted because I knew exactly what he meant. The room couldn't hear his words, but they could read my face. Dominic watched me closely now, irritation giving way to caution. For a second, he looked past me toward a corner booth where a few men sat too still, eyes locked on him, and I understood. His rage wasn't only about the watch. He was performing a power for someone. My father heard the change in my breathing and demanded I hand the phone over. I hesitated because giving him direct access felt like handing him a match. But Dominic stepped closer, reaching with the casual entitlement of a man who believes he owns every object in the room. So I held the burner out. Dominic took it. And up close, I could see tension in his jaw. He spoke into the phone with the same controlled arrogance he'd used on me, as if he could bully a stranger into backing down. For one heartbeat, he still believed the world belonged to him. Then I watched the moment he heard the name. Rocco Valenti. Dominic went pale so fast it was almost comical, except nobody laughed. His throat worked as he swallowed. His eyes darted to his men, then to that corner booth, then back to me. His hand tightened on the phone like he was holding something that could explode. My father spoke to him with calm, deadly clarity. He gave Dominic a small window to fix what he'd done before the consequences arrived. He described what would happen if I were touched again. No shouting, just inevitability. Dominic's eyes flicked to my swollen cheek. I saw him calculate a future he couldn't outrun. The call ended abruptly, like a verdict. Dominic lowered the phone slowly. His fingers trembled once. The VIP floor went so quiet I could hear ice shifting in glasses and someone's breath catching. Dominic handed the burner back to me as if it burned his skin. The hierarchy of the room tilted not toward me, exactly, but toward the countdown I had triggered. I wasn't safe. I was simply no longer convenient to hurt. Dominic snapped into damage control. He ordered his men to keep their hands off me and keep everyone else off me. He demanded that the doors be locked. He demanded the lights be turned up full bright and the music cut dead. The Cobalt Lounge stopped being a nightclub and became a sealed room with a ticking clock. I pressed the burner back against my ribs, tape and all, and felt shame settle like dust. I had broken my vow. Somewhere above the clouds, my father was coming to Chicago, and I wasn't sure whether I'd saved myself or unleashed something I could never put back. Dominic turned to his security and started the lockdown. The second the burner went dark, the VIP floor seemed to inhale and then forget how to breathe. Dominic DeSantis didn't look at me like a problem anymore. He looked at me like a fuse he'd already lit and now had to smother with his bare hands. His men were slower to understand. They stayed squared up, ready for the next order that would let them treat me like a culprit. The patrons felt it first. The wealthy couples and wannabe influencers leaned back, sensing this was suddenly bigger than a missing watch, the kind of bigger that ends careers and stains walls. Dominic's posture shifted like a switch. The rage that had filled him a minute ago collapsed into something tight and practical. He started issuing instructions with clipped control, and I watched the room's hierarchy rewrite itself around his fear. Nobody was allowed to touch me. Nobody was allowed to speak to me like I was trash. It wasn't respect. It was damage control dressed as manners. The whiplash made my stomach lurch. My cheek still throbbed. The bruise pulsed with my heartbeat, proof that his kindness only existed because I wasn't a nobody anymore. If my father's name hadn't landed like a brick in this room, Dominic would have let me bleed quietly and called it justice. The lockdown started like a drill. The front doors of the Cobalt Lounge were secured. Side exits were blocked. Security posted at every entry, like statues, scanning hands and faces. The music cut off so hard it left a ringing in my ears. Then the lights blasted up to full bright, harsh and unforgiving, turning the blue velvet and gold trim into something tired and ugly. Glamour evaporated. All that was left was sweat, fear, and too many eyes. People argued until they realized arguing didn't work in a sealed room. A few patrons tried to drift toward bathrooms or hallways, looking for distance, but they were redirected with flat hands and colder stares. Phones rose in the air until security started collecting them like contraband. Glenn Parker tried to keep up, smoothing his tie, forcing a smile that didn't belong on his face. He hovered near Dominic, nodding at every command, pretending he was managing an inconvenience instead of a crisis. Earlier, he'd offered me up like an easy solution. Now he tried to spin the same story for the guests, leaning on the word privacy like it was holy. Cameras were disabled for privacy, and privacy meant nobody could prove what Dominic had done to my face. Dominic turned toward me with a new kind of urgency, the kind that impersonates concern. A chair was dragged into the open space where I'd been standing like a target. Ice appeared in a metal bucket, plus a towel and bottled water. Dominic wanted me seated, cooled, and quiet. A fixed scene. A repaired mistake. I didn't sit right away. If I sat, it would feel like I was accepting the script he was writing. I took the ice myself and pressed it to my cheek, feeling the sting and numbness wrestle under my skin. Relief tried to rise, because at least the hands around me had stopped reaching. Then dread flooded in, because I knew what I'd just summoned. My father was already moving. That was the part that turned this into a countdown instead of a rescue. Every minute that passed was a minute closer to him stepping into Chicago, and my stomach twisted at the thought of what he'd do when he saw my face. I pictured Eli, small and warm in his bed, the cheap nightlight from Target throwing soft stars across his wall. I could not let my son's life get swallowed by this fallout. Relief sat beside shame. I'd promised myself I'd never drag Rocco Valenti back into my life ever again, never let Eli learn that name. But tonight I'd chosen survival over pride. Dominic's men began searching with the clean efficiency of people who hurt others for a living and call it work. They ripped open the booth cushions. They checked under tables, behind shelves, inside bins. They marched staff to the back corridor and ran through lockers and aprons, dumping trash cans onto the service floor. It wasn't a massacre. It was controlled humiliation, The kind that says you have no rights here, only permission. The staff's fear hit me hard. Women I'd shared breaks with kept their eyes down, terrified of being associated with me. I felt my old strategy rise up, be invisible, apologize. Don't challenge powerful men, but invisibility was a myth in a room with locked doors. My phone buzzed again. I didn't check it. If Eli's school nurse was calling, I was trapped. My mind did the ugly math anyway: rent, groceries, childcare, and how fast a single mom can get erased when men decide she's convenient. The patrons turned restless. Some tried bargaining with Glenn, offering money or favors to be let out. Others watched with the blank fascination of people who've never been powerless. The harsh lighting made everyone look older and meaner. Even Madison Clark, diamonds at her throat, looked less like a trophy and more like a woman realizing she'd bet on the wrong night. That's when I noticed the corner booth again. The men there weren't panicking. They watched Dominic with the calm attention of auditors, one of them checking his watch like he was timing Dominic's response. Dominic kept glancing that way, jaw tight, then snapping back to the search. I understood then why his earlier rage at me had felt performed. He'd been proving something to someone. The search dragged on, and with every empty pocket and overturned cushion, Dominic's panic sharpened. He had locked a room full of rich strangers inside his club, and he still couldn't produce the one object that might buy him time. His men kept reporting clean lockers, clean trash, and clean hallways. The watch was nowhere. Then Dominic's gaze landed on Madison again. Not with affection, but with suspicion. I remembered her drifting away from his booth earlier. Clutch tucked close, laugh too bright for the tension. I remembered how she'd watched him accuse me without lifting a finger, like my pain was entertainment. Dominic stopped pacing. His eyes narrowed, his attention pinned to the small silver clutch in Madison's hands, the one she hadn't let go of all night. In the harsh light, it looked heavier than it should have. His face hardened with a new kind of certainty, and I felt the next domino tilt into motion. The Cobalt Lounge didn't feel like a lounge anymore. Under harsh house lights, the cobalt glow vanished, and everything looked exposed. Designer jackets rumpled, lipstick smeared, perfume fought with the sour smell of spilled liquor. Booth cushions were split open, trash dumped onto a marble table, the glamour peeled back until all that was left was fear. I sat alone in a chair Dominic had dragged into the open, an ice pack pressed to my cheek. The cold numbed the skin, but it didn't stop the deep pulse underneath. My mouth tasted like pennies. I kept swallowing, like I could swallow humiliation and still make it home to Eli. My hands stayed steady only because I'd practiced looking calm when I wasn't. People were lined up against the wall. Wealthy patrons stared at anything except my bruised face. Staff stood stiff in black uniforms, terrified. Glenn Parker hovered near the bar with his manager. His grin turned into a grimace, trying to look useful without doing anything that might cost him. A screen flashed for half a second before a guard snatched it away, and someone whispered the time a little after 10:30. The words dropped straight into my gut. Rocco Valenti was already moving. A found watch wouldn't rewind the slap. Dominic wasn't hunting for a thief anymore. He was facing consequences. The search kept coming up empty. Dominic's men checked lockers. They ran their hands under tables and through purses. Each minute of failure tightened Dominic's face. His eyes flicked to my cheek, then away, like the bruise was a countdown he couldn't stand to watch. I could almost see him replaying the last half hour: who walked where, who touched what. Then his focus snapped toward Madison Clark. She stood beside the VIP booth like it was still her stage, hair perfect, makeup untouched. She held a small silver clutch tight against her body. Outrage painted across her face as if she were the victim of a rude delay. The room wanted to believe her. The villain was still the waitress. But my senses were sharp in a way I hated. Madison's grip on that clutch never loosened. She swallowed too often. She kept glancing toward the back hallway like she expected rescue or silence, and she couldn't look at my bruised cheek for more than a blink. Dominic moved toward her with a different kind of energy. Not flirtation. Not the loud anger he'd used on me. This was cold focus. The moment a man realizes danger might be sitting beside him. The patrons went quiet again because everyone could feel the story turning. Madison tightened her grip when Dominic reached for the clutch. For a heartbeat, she resisted. That tiny resistance said more than any speech. Dominic took it anyway, fast and absolute, the same entitlement he'd used on me earlier. The symmetry made me feel sick. He snapped the clasp and tipped the clutch over a marble tabletop. Lipstick rolled out. A compact clattered. A hotel keycard slid across the surface. A neat fold of cash landed too crisp to be tips. A tiny plastic sleeve followed it, with a SIM card tucked inside like a secret. Then the watch fell. It hit the marble with a heavy thud, not a sparkle. The rare watch Dominic had turned the room upside down for. The watch had made my pockets feel like public property. For one beat, nobody moved. Then the room released a low, shocked breath as eyes swung away from me and locked onto Madison. Staff who'd avoided my gaze stared at her with something close to fury. Patrons who'd watched my humiliation suddenly looked uncomfortable, like they'd just realized what they'd been part of. Dominic's men went rigid, not because the mystery was solved, but because they understood the real mistake. Their boss had hit the wrong woman, and the wrong woman had made a call. Madison's face drained, then tried to rearrange itself into innocence. She reached toward the watch like she could tuck the truth back into her purse. Dominic stopped her with a flat hand. He stared at the watch the way you stare at a weapon after it fires and you realize where you aimed. I thought I would feel triumph. Instead, I felt relief and grief colliding in my chest. Being proven innocent didn't unring the slap. It didn't erase the way the room judged me before it had facts. My cheek still throbbed. My dignity still felt scraped raw. Eli's face flashed in my mind, sharp as a warning sign. 7 years old. Asthma inhaler in his backpack. A school number that you can call at any time. I pictured his lunchbox waiting in my fridge, packed for tomorrow like I always did when I was scared. Apple slices, a sandwich, a little note. I pictured my phone going to voicemail because I was locked in a back room. I pictured rent and groceries and my manager calling me replaceable. Dominic's attention snapped to me, and I felt his instincts pivot. Fix it, pay it, threaten it into silence. He reached for control the way some people reach for air. He looked at Madison like she was suddenly disposable. He looked at me like I was suddenly valuable, and the hypocrisy burned hotter than the bruise. He hadn't cared about my pain when he thought I was nobody. He cared now because of who was coming to Chicago. The extra items on the table bothered me almost as much as the watch. Cash, SIM card, hotel key. They didn't prove a grand conspiracy, but they whispered preparation. And I couldn't shake the memory of Dominic earlier, how his rage had felt performed, like he needed an audience. I remembered a quiet man in a shadowed booth, watching Dominic like he was grading him. I remembered Madison glancing that way right before everything exploded. Maybe she didn't do it alone. Maybe someone nudged her hand, or nudged Dominic's temper, or both. I didn't have proof. I had pattern recognition from hard years. A guard hurried in from the back corridor, face tight. Glenn Parker went gray as he leaned in to pass the message along. Dominic's whole body stiffened, like a man bracing for impact. I didn't need the words. The countdown had reached its final minutes. Rocco's jet had landed, or his convoy was close, or both. Dominic's eyes flicked to my bruise again, and the watch on the table suddenly felt small and useless. My father wouldn't judge the logic. He would judge my face, right in my bones. The first sign wasn't Glenn's shaking hands. It was the street outside the Cobalt Lounge going quiet. The bass was already dead, the house lights still harsh, and yet I heard something heavier than music. Tires on wet asphalt, deliberate, rolling up on Kinsey like a verdict. Headlights sliced through the rain and splashed across the front windows. River North was usually neon and laughter, but this felt measured, not a crowd, a convoy. Black SUVs, lines, no show. They stopped with the kind of coordination you only get when nobody inside is nervous about being seen. Glenn's phone rang, and he answered too fast, eyes darting between Dominic DeSantis and the locked doors, like he'd been waiting for permission to stop pretending this was just a missing watch. The patrons stiffened. Someone lifted a phone again, and a guard calmly took it, palm open, no argument. The front doors didn't burst. They opened like the building had decided to cooperate. Men entered first, not giants, not flashy, just older and fit in dark coats, hair cut neat, faces blank. They moved with quiet economy, scanning corners, reading the room. They spread out without looking like a formation. And suddenly the VIP crowd looked like kids who'd wandered into an adult world. Then my father walked in. Rocco Valenti didn't look like the myth people whispered about. He looked like an older gentleman who belonged in a private dining room, not a nightclub in Chicago. Tailored overcoat, polished shoes, silver at his temples. His eyes found me instantly, and my stomach dropped the way it used to when I heard his footsteps in the hallway of my childhood. He crossed the room without rushing, but nothing slowed him either. Dominic stayed near his booth, the watch and the spilled contents still on the table like evidence nobody cared about anymore. Madison was pale, held in place by fear and by Dominic's men, who suddenly looked unsure which rules mattered. The patrons didn't know where to look, so they looked anywhere else. Rocco stopped in front of me, and the world narrowed to his hands. His fingers were warm when they replaced the melting ice pack, careful as if my skin could fracture. He tilted my chin toward the light, studying the bruise with an attention that felt like a spotlight and a prayer. I hated how fast my throat tightened. I hated how my body remembered being someone's daughter before I became someone's mother. Relief hit me first, childish and humiliating. I wasn't alone. Then resentment came right behind it. Where was this gentleness when I was 20 and begging for a different life? Where was it when I ran? When I changed my name? When I built a tiny apartment and told myself quiet was safety? Fear braided through everything because I knew what lived under my father's calm. I had seen the switch flip before. I had been raised by it. His gaze softened for one flicker, and I saw exhaustion there, the kind that comes from not sleeping, from searching too long. It punched a flash of memory through me. Signing a new last name on a lease. Learning to keep my face neutral when men decided they owned the air. I swallowed and tasted blood again. Rocco's thumb traced the edge of my bruise, and I wanted to lean into it and pull away at the same time. My mind jumped to Eli the way it always did when danger walked close. Eli is sleeping under his dinosaur blanket, trusting me to come home. I couldn't afford to be the girl I used to be. I had to be his mom. I had to survive this without turning his future into collateral damage. My father's hand dropped from my face, and the temperature changed. It wasn't magic. It was posture. The gentleness drained out of him as if it had been a private language meant only for me. He turned toward Dominic, and the father disappeared into the underworld leader. Dominic shifted without moving his feet. He stood taller, then smaller, recalculating like a chess player who realizes the board belongs to someone else. I watched his throat work as he swallowed. His eyes flicked to the locked doors, to his men, to the crowd, and none of it helped. Dominic's men felt it too. Their shoulders tightened. Their hands hovered near their jackets, but didn't commit, like they were waiting to be told what they were allowed to do. The crowd reacted like a single organism sensing smoke. Couples stopped touching. The people who'd been brave with cameras minutes ago stared at the floor. Staff shrank into the walls, terrified of being noticed. Glenn looked like he might faint, caught between employers and emperors. The Cobalt Lounge was still sealed, but now it felt less like a club and more like a courtroom with no exits. Rocco didn't glance at Madison. He didn't spare the recovered watch a second look. He didn't care who stole what. His focus returned to my bruised cheek for the briefest moment, then snapped back to Dominic with lethal simplicity. My father judged injury as an insult. Context was decoration. He had come for the bruise, not the logic, and that was what made him terrifying. Something ugly rose in me, something that wanted Dominic to pay because my cheek throbbed and because I was tired of swallowing humiliation. But right beside it was the mother in me, counting consequences the way I counted rent. If my father unleashed his rules in this room, it wouldn't stop at Dominic. It would ripple outward, and ripples always reach children. One of Rocco's men stepped forward and cleared the space the way a judge clears a docket. Another quietly positioned himself near Dominic, not touching him, just closing the options. The room waited, holding its breath with me. I understood what was about to happen before it happened. A sentence, a demand. The kind of consequence my father believed in, delivered in front of witnesses so nobody forgot. And as Rocco's gaze settled fully on Dominic, I realized I might be the only person in the room who could stop the worst version of it, even if part of me wanted to watch Dominic kneel. The silence after my father faced Dominic wasn't like the silence after the slap. That first one had been shame, hot and familiar, the kind that trains a woman to swallow her voice. This silence had weight. It turned the Cobalt Lounge into a courtroom, and I was the evidence under harsh light with an ice pack melting against my cheek. Rocco Valenti didn't negotiate. He assessed, decided, and the air rearranged itself around his decision. I ran because I didn't want my life decided in rooms like this. And now, because I needed to get home to my 7-year-old, I had dragged that old gravity into River North. Dominic tried to hold his posture. Chicago had made him dangerous in a controlled way, the kind of man who didn't need to shout to be obeyed. But my father was a deeper rule. His hand made a small motion. One of his men stepped forward like a closing door. Dominic's eyes flicked to his crew and back. The calculation landed hard. Nobody here could win this without turning it into a war, and a war in a sealed nightclub would stain everything. So Dominic went down. Not a polite bow. A real drop to one knee on the polished floor in front of his booth. The sound was soft, but it carried like a verdict. Staff stared at the floor. Madison hovered close, clutch empty, face still polished but eyes too bright. The watch had been found, Her theft had been exposed. She still tried to wear indignation like armor. My father barely spared her a glance. In his mind, the stolen watch was noise. The bruise on my face was the only fact. That fact tightened dread around my spine. I knew how my father treated facts. He answered them. Permanently. Context didn't matter to him. Injury was an insult. Insult demanded payment. I should have felt satisfied watching Dominic kneel. Part of me did. My cheek still burned. My stomach still remembered being lined up and searched while strangers stared like I was disposable entertainment. He deserved fear. Then Eli's face flashed behind my eyes. Eli has a backpack that is too big for his shoulders. Eli trusted me to come home even when my shift ran late. If blood spilled tonight, it wouldn't stay in this room. It would follow me into court dates and school offices, into the soft panic of a child learning his mother's safety is negotiable. I realized something colder than revenge. If my father punished Dominic the way my father wanted, I would be tethered to that punishment forever. Not as a woman rescued, but as a woman who brought a storm into her son's life. I didn't disappear for years just to hand Eli a new cage. So I stood. Every eye swung toward me. Dominic stayed on his knee, pride stripped down to survival. My father's attention shifted to me, heavy and personal. He wasn't used to being interrupted, but he had raised me. I didn't beg. I didn't soften. I made it simple. Killing Dominic would satisfy an old rule, but it would solve nothing for the life I was trying to protect. It would turn me into a headline and my son into a shadow. What I wanted was leverage that lasted. I asked for a life debt instead of blood. Not forgiveness, not romance. An obligation chain I could pull tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. Dominic would live, but he would live under my terms, and everyone in the room would understand the hierarchy had flipped. The terms came out fast because I'd been practicing survival for years. Immediate protection for me, Eli, and me starting tonight. Housing that couldn't be traced by anyone looking for me, with security that answered to the debt, not Dominic's mood. Legal cleanup where it mattered, so Eli's world stayed clean. Dominic's resources are redirected into stability through legitimate channels. Then the boundaries. Daily accountability. Dominic as shield, not owner. No access to my body, my choices, or my child as leverage. No speaking about me like property, not in public, not in private. A public acknowledgement too, subtle but unmistakable, so the room would remember who had been wronged and who now carried the obligation. If he crossed a line, the debt tightened. If he obeyed, he earned breathing room, not affection. I watched Dominic while my terms landed. Shame sat on him like sweat. Fear did too. But there was also understanding, the kind that says living with what you did might hurt longer than any quick punishment. My father studied me like he was seeing his own reflection in a different mirror. Pride flickered there, sharp and dangerous. Amusement too. Then the warning settled over it all. Mercy wasn't a weakness in his world. Mercy was a chain, and chains can be yanked. He agreed because a debt is quieter than a body. A debt can be enforced without sirens. A debt keeps everyone watching their step. The room exhaled like it had been underwater. Dominic stayed kneeling another heartbeat, not because he wanted to, but because the room needed to see it. Then my father allowed him to rise, and that permission felt like a blade sliding back into its sheath. My father's men began to move again, coordinated, already thinking about exits and cameras. My father didn't linger. He had made his point and taken his payment. Before he left, his gaze pinned me. Dominic's life now belonged to my terms, and my father would be watching how I held that power. When the doors finally opened, cold city air rushed in, smelling like rain and exhaust, and the normal world pretending nothing happened. My father disappeared into it as smoothly as he'd arrived, leaving the club to swallow itself back into silence. Dominic stood in the wreckage of his booth, bound. He looked at me like I was both his punishment and his instruction manual, and I realized the debt was only the first move. If I didn't set rules immediately, this could twist into another cage. Eli needed me to be safe. I needed to be free. So the next chapter of my life couldn't start with apologies. It had to start with rules, not romance. Starting with his penthouse doors. The Cobalt Lounge finally exhaled, but it wasn't relief. It was the sound of a room realizing it had survived something ugly and still had to live with it. Dominic DeSantis stood there, alive and suddenly careful, while everyone pretended not to stare at my bruised cheek. The ice pack melted in my hand. When the adrenaline drained, my legs felt hollow. My first clear thought wasn't Dominic. It was Eli, 7 years old, soft hair, warm sleep. I pictured him in our apartment, and my phone buzzing with missed calls from aftercare and the nurse line turned my stomach. Each vibration felt like a countdown I couldn't pause. People around Dominic started moving as new laws had dropped from the ceiling. Water appeared. A medic hovered with careful hands. Nobody touched me without permission. Nobody spoke to me like I was disposable anymore. The shift made me sick, because it proved the truth. They hadn't been afraid of hurting a waitress. They were afraid of hurting Rocco Valenti's daughter. Under harsh lights, the glamour was dead. Cushions ripped, trash dumped, velvet booths turned inside out. Staff stood in a line, eyes fixed on the floor. Patrons who'd filmed me earlier clutched their phones until security collected them. Glenn Parker, the manager who had tried to appease Dominic by offering me up, couldn't meet my eyes. I kept counting minutes because I knew my father was already in motion. The call had told me enough to feel pressure in my teeth. A jet, a convoy, men who didn't negotiate with time. Dominic was racing a clock nobody else could see, trying to fix a bruise before it turned into a war. Then the practical danger landed. Going back to my apartment tonight was not safe. Now that my name had been dragged into the open, retaliation could come from anywhere. It could look like a stranger waiting by our building's broken side door. It could look like a lie filed with the wrong office. I'd built my life on being unnoticed. Tonight burned that camouflage to ash, so I made a choice I resented even as I steadied my breath. I agreed to go with Dominic, temporarily, because his penthouse was the only place in the city that could become a controlled box fast. Cameras that worked, guards who didn't clock out, doors that didn't stick. A team afraid enough of consequences to respect my boundaries. Shelter, not surrender. The ride out of River North felt unreal. Chicago looked too bright, neon smeared across wet asphalt. I sat in the back of a black SUV that smelled like leather and cold air, staring at my swollen fingers and keeping my mind on Eli instead of my bruise. Around 1 a.m, he would be asleep. If it drifted closer to 2, my neighbor would start worrying, and worry turns into questions that can crack custody wide open. When the elevator opened to Dominic's penthouse, the quiet hit first. No bass, no laughter, no clinking glass. Just clean, hush, and air that smelled faintly of cedar. Polished stone, tall windows, art chosen to impress. No toys, no soft mess. It felt like a fortress built to display control. Dominic tried to fix what he'd broken with the only tools he trusted. Money, doctors, lawyers, security. A nurse arrived to examine my cheek and wrist without turning me into a spectacle. Someone offered to replace my phone and cover my missed wages. I accepted what protected Eli and kept my life from collapsing. But I refused to let any of it pretend the slap hadn't happened. Support could be practical. It couldn't purchase dignity. Before exhaustion could make me pliable, I set rules so clear they couldn't be twisted. Separate rooms, immediately. No entering my space without my permission. No touching me, not as an apology and not as a claim. Communication through his head of security for anything urgent, and direct contact with me only when it involved Eli's safety or my choices. My son came first in every decision. If I needed to leave, I would leave. If I said no, it meant no. Dominic didn't charm his way around it. He accepted through restraint. The guest room door locked from the inside. A security detail took positions that protected the hallway without hovering over me. He stayed out of sight while I washed and dried blood from my lip and stared at my own face in a mirror that didn't know what it had witnessed. And still, the moral weight sat on my chest. I had used my father's power like a flare gun. It saved me, but it wasn't clean. Rocco Valenti was not a fairy tale rescuer. He was the reason I learned to read danger in a man's posture. I felt grateful and sick at the same time, because I'd summoned him, and now he would keep a piece of me on a string again. As the penthouse settled into guarded silence, one detail kept scraping at my mind. In the club, the privacy cameras had been disabled as usual. Here, Dominic's security wall showed time-stamped feeds and access logs. One of his men mentioned that the VIP camera shutdown at the Cobalt Lounge had been triggered from an admin panel only a handful of people could touch, and the activity log for that exact window was missing. Not erased cleanly. Broken, like someone wanted the gap to stay. I lay on the guest bed staring at a ceiling that looked like a hotel brochure. Safe for tonight, maybe. Not at peace. My phone held enough charge to send one message to my neighbor, promising I was coming in the morning. Then I pressed my palm to my cheek and made a vow quieter than revenge. I would get Eli into my arms. I would enforce every boundary I named, and I would find out who engineered the setup behind the setup, because someone wanted me small, silent, and gone. Down the hall, I heard Dominic's security murmuring about who had admin access, who signed the privacy waiver, and who changed the shift log. Dominic wasn't looking at me. He was looking inward, at his own circle. I realized tomorrow wasn't romance. It was an investigation and a betrayal. Silence in the penthouse was supposed to feel safe. Instead, it felt like the pause after a door shuts, and the lock does not click. Chicago kept breathing outside the glass, sirens sliding along the river and fading. I tried to sleep, but my cheek pulsed, and the slap replayed. The VIP booth at the Cobalt Lounge, music dying mid-beat, faces turning into a jury, and me going still because I was used to swallowing humiliation. After 2 a.m, my phone finally stopped vibrating. That scared me more than the vibration. No missed calls meant Eli was asleep. It should have calmed me, but it only reminded me how thin our normal life was. 1 arrest, 1 blacklist, 1 rumor that I was a thief, and school offices started using the word unstable. I ran rent math like a prayer, then pictured Eli's lunchbox and the note I'd tucked inside. I promised myself I would not let tonight follow him home. I slipped out to the living room. The penthouse was modern and cold, all sharp angles and quiet art. Dominic's security team moved through it with soft shoes and controlled faces. His head of security, Marcus, brought facts in a steady voice and watched Dominic's reaction. First clue. The VIP privacy cameras being disabled was not routine that night. Marcus pulled system records that showed a manual toggle from an admin panel, approved minutes before Dominic arrived. Someone predicted the exact window when the accusation would happen and made sure there would be no video to contradict it. Second clue. The staff shift log from the lounge had a clean gap. A page was missing, not ripped in panic, but removed like someone wanted a single signature to vanish. The security report had a jump, too. A timestamp skipping forward with no explanation. Marcus said their logs were redundant. A lapse like that never happened unless a person inside made it happen. My stomach turned because I remembered Madison's clutch spilling more than the watch. Alongside lipstick and cards was a tiny plastic sleeve holding a burner sim. I had noticed it when the watch hit the floor, then forced my brain back to Eli and breathing. In the quiet, that sim felt louder than the thud. Madison was not just greedy. Someone had handed her a tool, and tools come with instructions. Dominic stood across the room, not close enough to feel like a trap, but present enough to bend the air. I watched the realization crack through him. His temper had been used like a lever. Someone baited him into violence in public, knowing his pride would do the rest. He looked furious and ashamed, then controlled, like a man who finally understood he had been manipulated. I felt my own pattern recognition spark, the way it used to when survival meant noticing everything. The setup was not only about humiliating Dominic, it was about finding the softest target in the room and turning her into the match. I had been chosen because I was trained to be invisible, a single mom in a waitress uniform, tired enough to swallow insults, careful enough to avoid making scenes. Whoever engineered that night knew exactly who would take the blame without a fight. That reframing tightened my boundaries into something practical. I was not in this penthouse for romance. I was here because I needed Eli safe, and because I needed to see every move clearly. If Dominic's world was eating itself from the inside, my son could not be collateral. I would accept protection, demand transparency, and keep an exit plan ready. Marcus brought the last detail like a nail going in. A keycard used to access the VIP corridor had been cloned. The original belonged to someone Dominic trusted, someone who could walk anywhere without being questioned. When Marcus named the owner, Dominic's jaw tightened in a way that looked like pain. It was not Madison. It was one of Dominic's lieutenants, a man who benefited if Dominic looked reckless and weak. I stared at the city lights and felt the danger move closer, from the street to the walls. The club had been a stage. The penthouse was a chessboard. Dominic wasn't just trying to protect me now. He was trying to contain a rot in his own house. And I realized the next violence wouldn't look like a slap. It would look like leverage, exposure, and quiet containment. Part 10 was already starting. The penthouse felt like a museum after a riot glass, silence, and the sting of ice on my cheek. Dominic wasn't pacing anymore. He stood at the kitchen island with his sleeves rolled once, not to look human, but to work. The anger was still there, but it had been folded into something sharper. I watched him the way you watch a storm that has learned discipline. Marcus laid out what they had like chess pieces. The VIP camera toggle record, the missing staff log page, the cloned keycard trace, and the burner sim from Madison's clutch sealed in a clear sleeve. Dominic didn't raise his voice. He only asked for the name tied to the keycard and the admin login. And when Marcus said Grant Caldwell, the room cooled. Grant was the kind of fixer people called respectable because he wore suits and spoke in calm sentences. He handled licensing, inspectors, attorneys, and the quiet favors that kept the Cobalt Lounge untouchable. He also had access to flip privacy rules on and off, to make a paper trail disappear, and to benefit if Dominic looked reckless in front of the wrong witnesses. Dominic moved without theatrics. He had Marcus compile proof that could survive a courtroom and a boardroom. Timestamps, access logs, the toggle authorization, and the Sims connection history linked to Grant's burner number. Then Dominic made one call, not to threaten a body, but to lock down a life. I heard the shape of it in his stillness instructions to attorneys, to accountants, to someone at a bank who owed him. Within minutes, Grant's roots collapsed. Accounts were frozen. Corporate cards were shut off. The LLCs that held his condo and his car were flagged for audit. A city compliance office got an anonymous tip with documents, the kind that triggers inspectors and licensing boards like a chain reaction. Dominic didn't have to hit him. He only had to remove the floor under his feet. The last cut was social. Dominic forwarded the evidence to 3 people who mattered in his world. Men who could deny a rumor but couldn't deny a login record. He made sure Grant's allies understood they'd be next if they helped him run. Isolation was the cage, and Dominic built it with paperwork. I felt relief, and it scared me. This was restraint. But it was also a reminder that power didn't always come as fists. A man like Dominic could ruin you with calls and signatures, and the damage would look legal while it bled you dry. He did it because my rules demanded it, because Eli's safety demanded it. Dominic was learning that temper made him steerable. Control made him dangerous in a different way. Predictable, strategic, protective. But when Marcus's phone buzzed with a fresh message, someone outside asking about Rocco Valenti's daughter by my old name, I understood the truth. Grant was only the first piece. Somebody bigger had started this. And now they knew exactly who I was in this city tonight. Ice water sweated down the glass on the marble counter, a drip that sounded loud in a place built to swallow noise. The city glittered through the windows as it had never heard of the Cobalt Lounge, like my face hadn't been a headline inside a room an hour ago. My cheeks still ached under the cold pack, and the ache kept me honest. Dominic stayed on the other side of the room. He didn't try to fill the silence with apologies. He brought practical things, instead gauze, a glass, a phone charger set beside me, and then his hands back in his pockets, restraint like a rule he was forcing himself to follow. I didn't reward him by soothing the guilt off his shoulders. I needed him to be clear, not comforted. What we are is simple and complicated at the same time. Not lovers, not enemies, not a rescue story, not a cage. We are an arrangement carved out of consequence. He protects because he owes, and I accept because my son needs me alive more than I need pride. Still, there was a moment when I caught the man under the Empire tired eyes, controlled breathing, the flinch of someone realizing he became the monster in my memory. Heat flickered in my chest, and I shut it down with the same firmness I use when Eli begs for a second dessert. Tomorrow, I pick up Eli, and I explain a temporary new normal while Dominic's world circles the building like wolves. Morning light cut a thin stripe across the penthouse floor, and the coffee outside my door smelled too expensive for my life. In the mirror, the bruise on my cheek had turned a stubborn yellow, proof that the night was real, and my old rules died with it too. I used to survive by shrinking. I learned to be the waitress nobody remembers, the woman who blends into velvet and smoke. Now, security men straighten when I pass. They don't see Lena, the single mom. They see Rocco Valenti's daughter, and they treat my silence like a warning. It hurts, losing the quiet life I tried to build. It also lets me breathe, because I'm done begging to be safe. I'm a target now, and I chose leverage instead of helplessness. In a few minutes, Eli will step into this place, and I have to decide how to call it home.